Polina Leroy. I actually was born and grew up in Russia, and I lived most of my life in Russia. I moved to the US in 2017, which is about 7 years ago. And I find myself being in the very interesting position after 10 years of academia and research and, having a PhD in the background. I switched to being medical intuitive and learning about bodies and learning about also mental health, like feelings and beliefs and the spiritual aspect of who we are and how it all intertwined. And I think what I do is I bring my investigative mind into my work with bodies as a medical intuitive. And I love learning about bodies and how our physical health and mental health intertwined. And I love helping mostly women to overcome like mental and physical health challenges. That's my passion. And yes,
So,
I'm very, very familiar with the beast we call depression. I've been clinically depressed 3 times. So I'm, quite experienced here.
so take us right from the beginning. Why did you get involved in doing this? And when you say that you're curious about the body, right? Like I know a lot of people can take that and it can mean so many different things, right? So tell us exactly what you mean, because maybe my curiosity with the body is different than your curiosity with the body.
Yeah, definitely. So, it started for me back in 2000, probably 2008, when my father was diagnosed with cancer. And I honestly, like, I knew he has a cancer before he was diagnosed. I could feel it. There was something about his energy that shifted like significantly, and I could feel that something was eating him inside out. And then he got his diagnosis, and I knew that was it. Like I knew he's gonna die very quickly. And although doctors told us that no, it's not terminal, he has chance, and he went through surgery. Um, he was suffering for 2 years, and he died from cancer anyway. And after that, it was kind of around the same time when I felt like I'm reaching my glass ceiling in academia, and I wanted to explore what else out there for me. How can I, serve people? Because I felt quite limited in academia, and I felt also it is very corrupted area, at least where I was, and I felt like I couldn't be true to myself, and I wanted to be true. And that's exactly where my first depression hit me. And I experienced my father's passing, and I broke up with my fiance, and I felt like I'm no longer in the place where I feel aligned in terms of career. And pretty much all my life just crashed, and I found myself constantly crying. Like I was crying all the time, and I was um, doing a lecture, for example, teaching my students, and I would find myself started crying right in the middle of lecture, and I was like, well, that's not okay. I have to address it. And I would come home, and I would start crying and crying and crying. It was like unstoppable, right? And I consciously couldn't reach the reason. Like I couldn't feel exactly what I'm crying about. It was like without obvious reason. And I realized that I needed help. I needed professional help. And I tried several therapists until I found the right one. And through therapy, I realized that over the probably 10 years of my life, I was accumulating a lots of sadness and grief, and I didn't address them. I didn't process them in the right way. And that's how I ended up with depression the first time. Right? I had several breakups with my partners. I broke up with my fiance. I lost my father, and I was trying to kind of skip over it and keep moving because there will be some positive things in life, just cheer up and life will get better. And I didn't, I guess, value those feelings like sadness and grief. I didn't want to look at them. I didn't want to acknowledge them and give them space. And that's how I ended up depressed.
I know for me, I went through something similar. There was a time where I was living on my own
Mm-hmm.
and I thought that I was free from my parents' control. I moved to a different part of the city. I was making new friends. And there was one year that was particularly bad, similar to what you mentioned, right? My
Mm-hmm.
parents' divorce, I almost lost the job that I had, and I had a relationship that ended all within a few months of each other. And I don't think I went through depression, but what I think looking back, what I went through was I was grieving because I knew the old me was being changed into the new me because all these things were going on. And I look back at that version of terrain and I was put in a situation where I had to sink or swim. Is that something
Mm-hmm.
that you were thinking to yourself, thinking, you know what, I'm Polina. Either I'm going to let this consume me and I go to spiral into a very dark period, which a lot of people go through, or I need to figure something out because now I'm depressed. Where do I go from here?
Yeah, I think you're right about grief. Like I find honestly, three of my depressions definitely were associated with grief, all of them. The grief was starting point for them, or maybe catalyst, for all of them, because I think grief is such a misunderstood feeling. Because I think for many people, grief is only about losing a loved one, but it actually is such a complicated feeling and such a common feeling, because sometimes we can grieve our identity, right? That is no longer there. Sometimes we can grieve a life that could happen but didn't happen. We can grieve about our plans, right? That could have happened within relationship, for example, that we had, right? And so I think grief is definitely a contributor. And my experience was that I didn't want to look into it. I was trying to avoid it, and I didn't want it to affect me. But then I was forced to, look at this and accept, yes, I'm grieving, the passing of my dad, and I'm grieving my relationship that didn't happen. And I had to allow myself to feel this grief. And honestly, and I know, by the way, many of my clients that I talk to, for example, sometimes they would say, I can't allow myself grief. I don't have time for this. I have to survive. But I think we can actually go over this process faster. I don't know if faster is applicable here, but in the more natural way, when we allow ourselves to feel it as deep as it's possible right now. Does it make
I will
sense?
agree. Yeah, it does, because I think we prioritize our trauma, right? So I'll give you an example. If I know that my family member is sick and they're going to pass, right? But I'm struggling financially, I'm struggling to put food on the table, I have to make a choice. Which trauma
Exactly.
am I going to focus on, right? It's going to be the food and shelter versus that. So I think it's more of what people call jokingly a first world problem where you're prioritizing your different traumas. But if you're poor, the only thing that's on your mind is I'm poor, I need food, I need shelter. But when you're grieving, it's like, okay, the old me is dying. It's being changed. Like it's easier to identify grief when someone has physically died, right? But what about the emotional side? What about the mental side, saying that I'm a different terrain, I'm a different Polina,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but I have these other things that I need to focus on, and you have to juggle it because let's be honest, how many people can deal with multiple traumas all at the same time,
Right.
right?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. When I moved to the US, that was a time for my second depression. And I felt so deeply depressed because, I felt like a fish just thrown out of water. And like I lost my, in a way, kind of, I lost my community, my friends, my family, like all of that was left back in Russia. And I was faced with a completely new environment, new culture, new language, and I had to figure out, who am I here? And that's where I got so depressed because I couldn't find myself. I couldn't find a place for myself. And I talked to other women who moved like me, and they're like, what are you talking about? We didn't have time for depression. We had to survive. We had to make money. And I found myself, okay, I probably am in the privileged position where I can feel all these feelings. And other people who moved to the US just didn't have a luxury of it.
Yeah, like if you were to go to, let's say if you got 100 people, 50 people who are earning more than the average and 50 who are earning below the average income, right? If you were to ask them if they have time to be depressed, grieving, they're probably going to tell you no. And they'll say, because I'm focused on this. Whereas maybe someone in your position or my position, we have what we would call the luxury of experiencing these things is because we have the time to think about it, right?
Mm-hmm,
It's
mm-hmm,
like that
mm-hmm.
old saying where idle hands is the devil's workshop, right? If you're sitting at home with nothing else to do, many people do what? Think of what is going wrong with their life versus what is going right with their life. So I can see where people who were similar in your situation, who were moving, who were migrating to another country, another place, and saying that, hey, I don't have time for this because this is more important. When you heard that and you're seeing your peers saying that, how alone or maybe isolated did it make you feel?
Oh, horrible. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I felt very isolated. I felt it's like, feeling lonely, being surrounded by people and still feeling lonely. Feel like you're alone because nobody can understand where you're coming from and what you're feeling. And like it's so hard to explain somebody, right? I know I was lucky to be surrounded by so many loving and caring people, and still they couldn't get it. And that's why I think the depression is such a complicated issue, that it's so hard for us when you're inside there in this dark place. It's so hard to explain to someone else what's happening to you, and you don't want to bother them, right? You don't want to overcomplicate it, but at the same time, I had a conversation with a friend who moved a year before me. She moved to Germany from Russia. I moved to the US a year right after her. And she knew what I was going through. And she called me and she's like, well, how are you? And I started crying right away. I just couldn't hold it. I just broke in tears, and she's like, oh, I see what's happening, because I knew she was probably one of the people who knew what I was going through, and she was going straight for it. And I realized that all my feelings that I kept suppressed were just blew up when she just asked me, how are you?
We forget how powerful that is. How are you doing today? Like that could change someone's entire mood because we could be going through our day and not hear it ever, even though we want someone to ask. Like I work from home, but I remember when I used to work into the office and I used to travel to and fro, I could count on probably one hand how many times people ask me how are you doing.
Mm-hmm.
People are probably too busy.
Right, but another aspect of it, when they ask you how are you doing, do they really want to know? What do you think?
I think we assume that they don't want to know. Because how would you confirm that? Are you going to ask like if I were to ask you how you're doing, are you going to say, Terrain, do you really want to know?
I have a very funny story about it. So it was my first visit of the US. It was back in 2015, and I came to Montana to take my first class. And then, completely new culture for me. I have no idea. And to be clear, people in Russia don't ask, how are you? just don't, and especially, the person at the checkout, at the store, nobody's asking you how it is. They just count all the money you have to pay, and nobody's asking you about how your day is going. It's just part of culture. It doesn't happen. And so here I am in Montana on one of my first days, and I got so sick. I have a cold, like, with a runny nose and fever, and I'm getting in the pharmacy like honey, lemons, some Advil, whatever. I don't remember what it was, but like, it's all very telling about what's happening with me, and I'm looking horrible, like I have a cold. And the cashier asking me, how are you today? And I was like, could be better. And she's looking at me and like, you guys not from around here, are you? because because she doesn't expect to hear, like, that was my impression. She doesn't expect to hear, exact description of my feelings. Like, she doesn't want to know it. And here I am. I'm thinking, like, if she's asking, like, my first reaction, I have to be honest with her. Like, I'm looking horrible. I'm getting all this stuff. What do you think? How I'm feeling? Like, you know. And it was the first telling episode to me about how our culture is different.
Oh yeah, there's some people they will ask and they expect the answer is going to be that the person will say that they're doing well or they're good, right? So I'll give you an example. Sometimes when I ask someone like, "Oh, how are you doing today?" They tell me that the day is going well. You know what I do? I ask them, "Tell me what's making your day go well." So I challenge them to give me an answer because sometimes they think that my question is a default question, and so they give me a default answer. I was like,
Yeah.
"No, I really want to know. So tell me what's making your day go well." I was walking my dog today, and every
Uh-huh.
person I saw, I said hello to. I don't care if you give me a dirty look or not. I'm going to make you say hi because I'm going to look you in your face and say, hello, Polina. Right?
That's great. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's what we have to do more of because we're social creatures, right? We are
Yeah.
built to interact with people. So if I were to say to someone how you're doing and they're not doing well, like your example in the grocery store, that gives me the opportunity to say, okay, why isn't your day going well? Sometimes just showing someone you care, stranger or not, can improve your day. Now, I'm not asking, to say, okay, give me a big hug, let's go off to on a first
Right.
date, and then afterwards we
Mm-hmm.
get married. No, ideally, if that works, that works. But in a lot of cases, that may not work. But showing that we can care, I think, is a first step, especially when someone is suffering some type of depression, anxiety, or whatever it is that's going on every
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. Another thing that I was thinking while we're talking about depression is, um, right, about the luxury of feeling those feelings. Because, like, remember the pyramid of needs, Maslow, right? There are like basic needs, physical needs, right? Then safety, and then the social needs and self-actualization at the top. And like, he's very clear that unless those physical and safety needs covered, like, you don't get to experience like other high levels of needs. They're not available for you, right? They're not accessible for you. But at the same time, as a medical intuitive, right, I want to share the point. What unfortunately is something that I see very often is that how negative feelings that we experience and suppress because we don't have time to feel them, how they actually being stored inside the body and how they affect us. That's not an easy, topic, but it is there. It's in the body. And what I see is that the feelings that we not processed, we not give them space, we not let them go, they actually negatively affect our physical health in terms of they make our organs vulnerable to pathogens, to disease, right? So they create higher risk to develop disease.
day. I will agree. And I think there was, I forget the name of the book, but there is something, I think it's called Your Body Holds the Score in regards to
Uh-huh, uh-huh,
trauma,
uh-huh.
right? So anytime you're going through something and you're suppressing it, your body will show it in different
Eventually.
ways, right?
Hmm.
So the longer it goes on, your body's going to eventually show it. So you may be a good job of not, or poor job, depending on how you look at it, right? Of not communicating it, but your body will show you and it will show others. Because you mentioned the pyramid of needs, and you have the safety near the bottom, and then you have the psychological, and then you have love. So as you're escalating, you can go up. But there's some people, to your point, right? They don't have time to focus on what they truly want or the needs, right? So their
Hmm.
safety is food, shelter, which is for a lot of people, right? So they're already skipping one. Once they have that, I think a lot of people tie in the other ones. But for you and I, or for other people who have the time, we can say, okay, we need this, we need this, we need this as we're going up. So I wonder how many people accept just the basic needs of life and then convince themselves that they're okay,
Hmm.
right? Like that may be a question for those who are struggling understanding, hey, there's other things in life that you need to prioritize as well. But because they're not thinking about it, because they're preoccupied with the main focus of, I need to make sure my basic needs are covered. If I have that, I'm good.
Do you have children?
I don't have children.
Good for
I have a
you.
dog. I have a dog. It's
I'm
like a
just,
child.
yeah, I'm just thinking about like how many mothers like I know that, it's like when you have to take responsibility and take care of yourself, right? It's a one level of busyness and responsibility. Then when you become responsible for your child, one, two, three, it's a completely different thing. Like you don't have time for yourself until your kids go to bed, like in like 8, 9, and then you're so exhausted and you just want to just crash, right? And especially like if single mothers, I'm thinking, or single, parents, gender doesn't really matter, like, but you solely responsible for your children and you have to make it through the day and take care of them, and you don't usually they we try to don't show our stress, right, and don't project our stress on our children, right, keep it to ourselves, but it's such a load that eventually will play out, if we want it or not, it is there and it's going to show up, but through the physical symptoms already, because the body kind of doing this heavy lifting here with all these feelings that have been suppressed for so long, and it wants attention, and it doesn't have any other way to get attention as through creating pain for us.
I wonder if that's a result of, because when you have a child, from the parents I speak to, they're taking on some of that burden from the child, because the child doesn't know until they're old enough to know, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, they're splitting it, and they went from taking care of themselves to now they're taking care of another person. So the load has increased.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you have a child raised between two parents where the load can be distributed equitably, not equally, right? But equitably, versus, let's say, a single parent who's struggling to maintain the load of the household, parenting, being themselves, as well as working. That's a lot just for two shoulders. And I
It is
think
a lot.
maybe that's where the disconnect is, because they're trying to do everything at once. And I find that a lot of mothers, specifically now, will put themselves on the back burner for their family in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think you're right, and it's a hard place to be, and I think we still need to do a lot of work to support those women. And I would love society to see society doing better job as providing the support that single mothers need. But what happens often is that mothers feel like they have to sacrifice everything they have in order to raise the children, where healing usually happens is that when we prioritize ourselves, our needs, and we show up as better mothers, usually when we take care of our physical and emotional needs. At least that was my experience. Like, we, we're getting close to my third depression here. But that was my third depression, was postpartum depression. And my first year postpartum was so horrible. And again, it was grief. Again, I was grieving the previous version of myself, right? The previous life that I had without the baby, where I had all the time I wanted for myself and I could do whatever I wanted. And I felt I felt in control of my life. And then when you have a baby, like, you don't belong to yourself. Oh, like, who cares what kind of needs you have? You don't have time to go pee or, take a shower. Like, basic needs, they gone. And it's so hard to actually get back to, oh, but like, I have needs too, and I have to find a way to address them if I want to be a good mother. So that was my struggle. I had to find a way how to start paying attention to what I want, what I need, and how to find a small ways here and there, but give myself what I need.
I wonder if I look back on, because you and I look like we're relatively close to the same age. If I look back, let's say 2 generations ago, where
Mm-hmm.
raising a child was something that was more family centric and more community based. You essentially didn't do it yourself, right? If I look at that, how at least in my culture, there's always what we would call like big mama and grandfather, where they would
Mm-hmm.
help out almost equally to what the parents would do for the child. So you had, let's say, four or more people raising the child, right? So let's say, for example, if you weren't able to do certain tasks of parenthood, you at least had the father, you had the grandmother, you had the grandfather, but you had two sets, right? So you had a total of 6 people helping out. And now, where I look at more and more people are having children outside of marriage, or maybe not including other family members, there's probably they're not evenly yoked,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's always going to be one person who's going to take on more responsibility in the household. And I think parenthood gets discounted because a lot of men will take on the task of, I'm going to be the provider of making the home a home, and the woman's going to be the organizer and the navigator of the home inside, right? Everyone has their responsibility, but what happens now is, if one person feels that the load is too great, where's the support for them, right? Because you can't go to the other person and say, sometimes you feel like you can't go to the person and say, can you do a little bit more and I do a little bit less, unless you have that communication. And I think that's probably what's truly missing between the two people when it comes to raising a child. It's always, I'm going to do my thing, you're going to do your thing, cross our fingers, and we hope for the best.
Right? So that's where your marriage and your relationship and your communication skills being tested, right? Can you communicate about your needs? Because um I think having a baby is such a critical point. It's such a test for relationships, for marriage, and so many relationships unfortunately can't stand the test, right? They break because it's like, it's shifting the whole system. You have another element in the system, and so much shifting. And we were struggling with my husband. It was really tough for us to find the way. Okay, what do we do now? Because it's so hard, honestly, to communicate about my load. I feel like sometimes uh, he's coming home from work, he is tired and he wants rest, but I'm tired too, and I feel like, okay, can you, as a you know as a papa now, as a as a dad, pick up my load and give me some rest, because I'm like about to crash here. And he's like, but I'm tired too, and oh, it's tough.
It can be like, there's someone who I know, they're married. They've been married for a long time. I forget how long, but they've been married a long time. when they need time for themselves to lessen their load, they
Mhm.
have support. They have the grandparents, they have the aunt, they have the uncle. And sometimes I think, is that, can it be that simple? Is that what's truly missing when the wife or the mother is tired and she just needs an escape because she's burnt out or she's feeling overwhelmed, and the father is feeling the same thing? Where do they go? Because at the moment, they can't go to each other because they're both overwhelmed, but the
Yeah.
child needs someone. Where do they go?
Mhm. Yeah. No, I think that's a great point, and you find ways, right? I think s- when you can go anywhere, that's where the crisis happens. Ideally, we want to have some support um, in face of like grandparents and friends, like family members, or like you can find babysitter ideally, right? And go have some time, go have a date, or sometimes like we found a way to have play dates for my daughter when she goes play with other kids her age, and we have a break. We have who she is playing, she's fine, and now we can have some time for ourselves. So that's a relief. But it was hard, and I know how many families struggling with it because you want to have grandparents being somewhere close to you, living with you. But for example, my mom is living in Russia, and like, I don't have this support, which I know she would love to spend time with her granddaughter, but she's not here. What can you do? So sometimes it just happens that, grandparents not available, they're not here.
Yeah, and that does happen quite a bit. Because if you take it back, there was a time where the grandparents were down the street,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like your immediate family was within the same city. Now, because the world has expanded, right? I can be in one part of the world, my grandparents in another part of the world, my parents in another part of the world. So we're so separate from it versus, let's say, back when, because I was raised by my grandmother, right? So when my grandmother took us out, I remember we were able to walk or take the bus to her sisters, her brothers. They're all right close, right? So let's say, for example, she wasn't able to do something, she can just easily transport and say, hey, can you watch terrain for a couple of hours as I go do this? Now you have to get on an airplane.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? So you have to figure it out yourself. And it takes me to an earlier point that we're discussing, that making the time. Could it be that maybe these people don't have the time to think about the impact of them not taking care of their own health
Mm-hmm.
in raising that child?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think like, that what I think that was who said it? Einstein, that sometimes problems can be solved on this level of consciousness where they created, right? You need someone's help to get out of a situation and have a helicopter view, right? You need to have a bigger picture to be able to see all those, you know, issues and how they actually make it all more difficult, more complicated. And I found therapy being very helpful to me to have this view, because I remember when I was like in the midst of my postpartum depression and I talked to my therapist and she was asking me, what do you do for yourself? And it was questioned totally out of nowhere. And I was like, what do you mean? And I was like, oh, okay. Well, I'm getting coffee in the morning and croissant when I take my daughter to playground. And she was like, that's it? That's it? And she's like, I'm sure you can do better than that.
I asked the same question. I asked the woman I work with, I asked them, okay, what do you do for yourself? What are your hobbies? And and the person that they describe, they're no longer that person. They'll say, I used to do this and this, and then I had a family. I was like, okay, are you still doing it? And they say, no, they've completely lost who they used to be.
right?
And now they don't even recognize the person that they are.
I can completely relate to this because having a family is shifting so much, and it feels like sometimes you don't belong to yourself, but it's like in the beginning it totally makes sense because when you have this newborn that completely depends on you, right? You are their survival. They need you all the time. And you losing yourself in all of this. But then it's your responsibility to find yourself back again. Because, if you don't do it, nobody will do it for you. And so how many women are being lost in this, and they don't realize that there's someone else except mother, right? They become mothers and that becomes their identity. And they lose the part of themselves who are not mothers. But nobody gonna do it for you. You have to do it for yourself. Um, to realize that okay, I'm my own person, right? I have my own needs, I have my own dreams, I have my own desires to go after. And more so, I think when we allow ourselves to acknowledge this part that is not apparent, we our children are only going to benefit from it because we're going to be such an inspiration for them.
Absolutely. Like if you're married with children, you are three people, right? So I'll use myself as an example. I'm Terrain, I'm a spouse, I'm a father. I have to somehow balance the three
Mm-hmm.
to ensure that all three thrive and more importantly survive. Because what normally happens is that you go from Terrain, let's say you get married and then you have children. I went from Terrain to a spouse. Now, for some reason, Terrain is gone. So there's a grieving period, right? And maybe I don't even have time to grieve because I'm so into my marriage. And then if there's a child born, I'm a father. And there are studies that would say that a child would change the marriage in a lot of ways. Like some people feel like they don't even recognize their spouse anymore because they're not able to interact with them, be intimate with them, have a conversation with them. They're so focused on the child that they
Mm-hmm.
feel neglected. And there's a lot of people who end up getting divorced because now they're second fiddle to something that they really, really were into, but because the dynamic has changed, they don't want to compete with a newborn. And we shouldn't shame those people because those are true feelings that they have, but it is an unfortunate situation to be a part of. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, what would you say to those people who are suffering that aspect, who feel lost in their marriage, who feel like they're being replaced, and who ultimately don't know what to do because they can't find or remember who they were?
Well, I think, and unfortunately, I think you're so right. Like, I had so many examples of how um, men would be, I don't know what's the word, like pushed out of the system. There is a mother, there is a child, sometimes grandmothers in the system, and the man, is gone. Like, we don't need you. But I think it's a visibility. It's what's happening seemingly like we don't need you, but they do, they do need. And I think when it happens is again, it's communication problem. And um, I think ideal solution would be actually for the father instead of being instead of feeling like he doesn't belong in the system anymore, feeling like I have to be more present as a father because that's what mother actually needs. When she can split the time with the child, with the father, she's going to get closer to her true self and she's going to feel better. The system will shift back into new normal when father is present in relationship with the child, um, as much as mother, or at least, like 20-30%, right? In the beginning, it's mostly on mother, but he has to step into those relationships and spend more time with the child because that's what mother needs, actually. She might not be able to communicate it, but that's what she needs.
So, could it be like be more visible and demonstrate why you're needed versus I'm just trying to put myself in that situation. So if I'm
I
in
would
that
say,
situation, like would it be
I
more
would say
visible to as a father or more visible as a spouse?
more visible as a more available as a father. Like that's what I would like to see, I guess, from my husband, and that's what I know that like so many women who suffer in this would like to see. Be more available as a father, more proactive. Even if I'm not asking for help, I still need it, and I would appreciate if you would uh, say like, I will take care of baby, go have some rest, go take a nap, right? Because like usually what happens is that mother is trying to do all of it until she's losing it, right? Until like she's like, can't do it any longer, you know? At least that was happening in our family. I would my daughter would cry in, in her crib in her bedroom, and I would go like soothe her and put her back to sleep, and then she would wake up again and again and again until I'm like losing it because I can't do it any longer and I want to sleep, just, and my husband would be like, why don't you ask for help? And I was like, I need you to go there and, help me, but I need you to do it before I'm losing it, right? And like, do you know what I mean? Like, I would love to get this help before I'm at the point zero where I can't longer contain my frustration and my feelings.
I think many men have a tendency to get involved when it hits the fan instead of
Yeah,
before the fact,
but yeah, exactly.
right?
Mhm,
Just because
mhm, mhm.
there's a disconnection between the two. So because in most relationships, both parties are going to have to end up working. That's just the way the world is these days, right?
Yeah,
So both will come back from work. So I could see maybe if this was like 100 years ago, where the man was out in the field slaying the woolly mammoth, right? And the woman that was at home. But because both are out and about working, and when they come home, I think there has to be that communication piece saying that, okay, when we come home, the first person, this is their tasks.
hmm
And then
hmm
when the other person comes home, they do this. So if I come home first, I make sure, okay, I'm going to pick up the child, make
yeah,
sure the child is okay, make sure they're understanding, make sure they get something to eat. And then when you come home, you can pick up after that. Maybe the dishes need to be washed. Maybe I can take on some of the responsibility of nurturing to the child to give you a break. And then we alternate.
yeah,
Sometimes when I speak to married couples, they seem to be winging it, where it's just like whatever happens, happens. We don't have a game plan. But how would they know who needs what if they're not communicating what their needs are?
yeah. There's no way of knowing. That's why I think communication is such a basic, like fundamental skill, to have. And it's also, as we, I think, talked before, it's a luxury to, I guess, to have time sometime, right? To prioritize our marriage. So we will find time to sit down and talk through. Because when it's all over the place and you just, don't have time to sit and talk about it, all these problems they build up, and all these emotions that we experience, or sometimes pain that we cause to each other because of all this chaos that we live in, right? If we don't talk it through, it's going to get worse and worse and worse to the point where like two roommates live, in the same house, and sometimes they're like, okay, I think we're done here at the point, to a certain point. Unless we feel like we have to prioritize our marriage, we have to prioritize our relationship, and we have to find time for ourselves to sit down and clear the air, right? Talk through what's happening, how can we make it better. um yeah, it's only gonna get worse.
What are some of the ways that you were able to overcome what you went through in your life?
um well, my problem was that my depression was kind of complicated because I had not just depression, I had a postpartum rage, if you know what I mean. I don't know if you heard about it. It's actually a quite common aspect of depression when it's not just the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness, it's a feeling of uncontrollable rage. Like I I never knew I was capable of it. I was a monster. I became a monster, you know. I was so angry most of the time, and I was kind of constantly on the edge. Like the problem was that I would freak out and I would become just, fire uh, with any slight kind of obstacle. Oh, my juicer doesn't work, and I'm just throwing the juicer out, and it's like, crashing into pieces. I have to be honest, I broke so many things in my house during the first year of postpartum. There's some holes in the walls because I had uncontrollable rage. And what happens is that, as a medical intuitive, I know what's happening is that because of birth, uh, throughout the pregnancy, woman's liver is already overloaded, but then there's the birth that adds extra load to adrenals. And because adrenaline and cortisol is such a toxic hormones for the body, the liver has to absorb all of it. So it's additional load for the liver. And the problem is when all these things happen in the liver can't contain all the toxins in the within, and it spills them out, and they end up in the bloodstream, and through the bloodstream they end up in the brain. And that's one of the physical aspects of depression postpartum, right? Where actual toxins end up in the certain parts of the brain that are responsible for emotional regulation, and feeling depressed or sometimes anxiety, right? There's an actual physical reason for them, not just a shift in the family system, right? In the responsibilities and identity, but actual physical reasons. So I think part of our problems was that I pretty much almost became violent, but I knew it wasn't me. Like, it's not normal me. Like, everyone who knows me know that I'm very peaceful and calm person. And the person who was like after birth, that wasn't me. Like, and I had to find a solution, and I did it through detox. I had to do very serious liver detox in order to become a normal person again. Uh, and I think that helped a lot, because I remember my husband saying that, like, that's not okay. That's not who you are. Like, we need to find a way to address it, because I was constantly raging. Like, I would just yell at everyone, and I knew that there was no way to address it on the mental level or emotional level. The therapy wouldn't help because I could feel it's a physical reason for that. There's no way, like, somebody would, tell me, oh, you can just take a few deep breaths, like pause, how they tell you before you start yelling, just take a few deep breaths and it will be better. No, there's no way it will help me. I had a very like, I could feel it. There's a physical imbalance in me that made it impossible for me to regulate my emotions. And I had to address the physical aspect of it. That's why I think it's so important. And so many professionals in the mental health field, unfortunately, don't know about this physical aspect, but it is out there and it's affecting us. And how many men we know who lose the ability to regulate their emotions and their anger, and it also happens because of physical reasons as well, because of physical aspect. So I think my awareness that there is a physical aspect to depression helped me to actually overcome it, because that's what I did. I did liver detox and I had a therapy again, right? So addressing it on the mental level and addressing it on the physical level, that was my solution to the third depression that I had.
How surprised were you, like looking back now, how surprised were you to see the type of person that you were back then?
I was horrible. And I had such a tremendous shame about it and guilt, because someone who has a psychological education, someone who knows what the trauma is, right? Because I've worked with so many people helping to heal their traumas, their childhood traumas. And here I am causing my child this same trauma just because I'm yelling at her and I'm raging at her. And she's a baby and she has nothing to do with it. Like the shame I felt, the guilt I felt about it was overwhelming. But at the same time, like there's no way out of this except forgiving yourself and taking action towards healing it.
So
Because
what's
shame is gonna keep you there.
and that's the power of shame. Like shame can do one of two things, right? It can make you want to change your behavior very quickly. Say,
Mm-hmm.
okay, I feel this, I don't want to feel this anymore. Or alternatively, it can make you just stay inside of it and sit and let it fester because you're like, I can't believe I'm this person. Then you begin to um, think of all the bad things that you've done, how bad of a person you are. Then your mind starts to create this view of you in your mind. And then maybe sometimes you'd question it, right? Am I really like this? Am I really a bad person? Am I a horrible mother, a horrible wife? Like, what were some of the thoughts that you had going through your mind as you're reflecting on that and you're thinking, oh my God, I am this person. What has happened to me?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I was thinking. Like, I can't, like, can't believe I am this kind of mother that I thought because my daughter was so long waited, and I thought with all my background, with all the healing I witnessed for others, like I will definitely make sure that she will not experience any of that, right? And here I am causing all of this for her, and I felt, yeah, shame was horrible. Yeah, I felt so ashamed of it. But at the same time, as someone who knows how shame works, right? The shame is very disconnecting. The shame disconnects us, isolates us with our feelings about ourselves, with our beliefs that how bad we are, right? That we're not worthy. It disconnects us from others because we believe that we're not worthy of true relationship and true connection. And actually, this same thing as happens as a symptom as actual solution, because I think the only solution to shame is actually start sharing what's happening here. You sharing about what are you ashamed of, and if you're lucky enough to share it with the person who can express compassion, empathy, you will be healed, because that's what we need. We need to be seen with at our worst and still be told that we are a good person, right? That we're okay. And it happens to everyone. That's what we need.
So as we close, like what's some advice that you want to give to the men and women out there who need to be seen and need to experience themselves in a better way, just like how you described?
Um, I would definitely recommend to find a safe connection, find a safe person, safe relationship, someone who will be on your side, someone who will not start blaming you and telling you, oh, how horrible, I don't want to have anything to do with you now. Someone who will be able to contain this, right? Hold a space for you and allow you to feel heard and seen, right? It can be a therapist. For someone, it can be a very good friend. I think therapists usually like qualified at least for this, right? To hold a space like this. Because not everyone can. Another shameful period, or not, probably like a guilt I had when my daughter burned her hand. She was, say, 7 months old, and we're at a restaurant, and the a waitress brought a very hot dish and she put it right in front of me. My daughter grabbed it immediately and it was seconds. And she burned her fingers and it was so bad. It was a very bad burn. And we went to hospital and she was crying and crying and crying. And it was breaking my heart. And when we came to hospital and they, took a look and say, oh yeah, it's pretty bad. So we need to put a cast on her. And then they say, we need a trauma specialist here. And I was like, oh, how? Like, I like this approach that, they want to address, she's 7 months old, and they still want to address it as a trauma. And I was like, oh, how deep, And turns out the trauma specialist came from me and not for my daughter. And they were talking to me and asking me, they put me in a separate room and they're like, now, how are you feeling? What's happening to you? And I was like, oh, I started crying again. I said, oh, I feel so guilty that like I was right there with her. They didn't protect her. And he said, you know, you as a mother, you have to get used to it. Guilt will be your second nature because you love your daughter so much. You will always want to do the best for her, but you are a real person, right? You are limited and you won't be able to protect her from everything. So just get used to it. It will be there for you all the time, this feeling of guilt. But you need to find a person. And he asked me, do you have someone who you can vent it on? Someone who will not try to solve it for you, someone who will not give you advice, but someone who will be able to listen to you. And yeah, I was like, yeah, I guess I can talk about it with my therapist, right? But I think that's what we need, right? We need a person who will be able to hold a space for us without judgment, right? Not judging us, just holding a space. Let us talk about it, let us express it, and then just saying that, it's okay. You're still a good person, even if you did this. If you're going through this, you're still a good person, and you can do better.